Origins of the English by Eternal England. Preface. Often in discussions of indigenous English heritage, one will find himself confronted with the same lines of attack. What do you mean by English? The English are just Germans. Or that we, in the same sense as the Americans, are nothing more than a nation of immigrants, simply a melting pot of different peoples, and, as such, have no claim at all to indigeneity. This denial of historical fact is deliberately designed to erase any claim of a stable English heritage. In this essay, I will dispel this myth and argue that not only is our ethnic heritage clear, but we have actually been in Britain for an incredibly long time. After seeing claims that the Sami people of Scandinavia are the only indigenous people in Europe, which will be the topic of a forthcoming essay, I felt compelled to make the case on behalf of the English for our claim to indigeneity in these isles. Neolithic Britain. Little is known of the Neolithic 4000 BC to 2500 BC inhabitants of Britain, other than that it was they who built Stonehenge, that they farmed, and that they seem to have been from the Mediterranean and Iberia, probably moving through modern-day France before arriving in Britain in around 4000 BC. It is assumed that they would have had olive skin, brown eyes, and dark hair. A 2017 study suggests that the Neolithic population of Britain may have been replaced in around 2500 BC by the Beaker people, hailing from the lower Rhine region of modern-day Netherlands and Germany. It is thought that around 90% of the Neolithic population at this time was wiped out. No evidence has been found of large-scale conflict or genocide, so it is assumed that this near extinction came about as a result of bubonic plague, which the island-dwelling natives were unable to resist due to lack of immunity, or simply that the Beaker people, with their more advanced technology, were better at adapting to the environment and slowly gained a monopoly over the most fertile land. According to Professor Ian Barnes of the Natural History Museum, following the Beaker spread, there was a population in Britain that for the first time had ancestry, skin, and eye pigmentation similar to Britain's today. The Beaker people and their culture spread throughout ancient Britain. They, probably similarly to the Neolithic Britons who they replaced, held religious ceremonies at stone circles and lived in clans led by powerful chiefs. Based on this evidence, we can pinpoint roughly 2500 BC as our starting point for contiguous inhabitation of Britain by the Beaker people, who would later become the Celtic Britons. Celtic Britons. The Beaker people were not one people. They were made up of many tribes who eventually came to be known as the Britons. The period between the arrival of the Beaker people and the Roman invasion of 54 BC is not well documented, and untangling what we do know is very messy. Prior to Romanization, there was no writing in Britain. There is almost no agreed upon definition of what Celtic means, whether it should be regarded as a purely linguistic term or an ethnic one. It has been used in various ways historically. Whatever the explanation, by the time of Caesar's invasion of Britain, the native Britons were Celtic, speaking a form of insular Celtic known as Common Brittonic. Oversimplifying grossly, the theory seems to be that Bell Beaker culture developed through several different forms: Unitas, Tumulus, Ornfeld, Hallstatt, before forming into a proto-Celtic culture seen both in Britain and across Europe. According to Alexander Faliliev, since there is no evidence that the regions of Western Europe where Celtic languages are still spoken today became Celtic after 1600 BC, they must have become so at an earlier date. Before 1600 BC, the only time when the zones which gave rise to the North Alpine and Atlantic complexes shared similar material and structural characteristics was the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. This was the well-known Bell-Beaker package, linking all the regions where a Celtic language was later to be spoken. This community represents a unique situation. Put simply, it seems that Celtic language and culture developed simultaneously in Britain and Western Europe, presumably through trade and due to its use as a European lingua franca. Romano-Britons. The interior part of Britain is inhabited by those who claim to be indigenous on the strength of an oral tradition. Julius Caesar. Following the Romanization of British culture, the inhabitants came to be known as the Romano-Britons. These were the native Celtic Britons who inhabited the parts of Britain which were under Roman rule. The name should not be taken to give the impression that these people were formed of a mixing between Romans and Britons, however. According to Stefan Schiffels of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, we can now say for sure that the Romans did not leave much of a trace and did not contribute much to the British gene pool. The Romano-Britons were ethnically identical to the Celtic Britons, the difference being that they had been culturally Romanized. As Britain was a colony of Rome, there was very little intermarriage or mixing between the Roman occupiers and the native British people. There is little Roman DNA in the British genetic makeup. The Anglo-Saxons. Many people seem to think that the Anglo-Saxons replaced the native British population in England, but this is not the case. In fact, 60 to 90% of the average Englishman's DNA comes from the Celtic Britons who inhabited the island we still call home to this very day. The majority of eastern, central, and southern England is made up of a single, relatively homogeneous genetic group, i.e. the Romano-Britons, with a significant DNA contribution from Anglo-Saxon migrations, 10 to 40% of total ancestry. This settles a historical controversy in showing that the Anglo-Saxons intermarried with, rather than replaced, the existing populations. I think it is this common misconception which leads people to believe that the English have only been here for 1600 years or so. On the basis of a small set of written sources, it was supposed that the local Romano-British population was largely replaced by migrants from the German-speaking part of the continent. This historically attested migration is difficult to determine from or reconcile with the archaeological record. We can see that despite repeated invasions taking place across centuries, the genetic makeup of the native Britons was not radically altered. In any case, the Celtic Britons and the later Anglo-Saxon settlers were very similar to begin with, both tracing their origins back to the Bell Beaker people. Peter Donnelly, director of the Wellcome Trust Centre for Human Genetics in Oxford, conducted a study in which 2,039 participants' DNA samples were analysed. The participants were selected based on the fact that all four of each participant's grandparents had lived within an 80-kilometre radius of one another. The grandparents' average birth year was 1885, which means that this analysis provides a snapshot of British ethnic heritage prior to any immigration occurring after that year. The findings showed 17 distinct clusters and found that, in fact, all 17 clusters are dominated by DNA from settlers that arrived prior to the Anglo-Saxons. In his book Blood of the Isles, geneticist Brian Sykes states that we are an ancient people, and though the Isles have been the target of invasion, ever since Julius Caesar first stepped onto the shingle shores of Kent, these invasions have barely scratched the topsoil of our deep-rooted ancestry. Historian James Hawes, in his fantastic book The Shortest History of England, lays out how, following the Romans' abandonment of Britain in 407 AD, due to the needs brought about by civil wars elsewhere in the Roman Empire, the Britons found themselves without help in fending off aggression from the barbarian Picts, Scottish, and the Scots, Irish. So the Britons invited the Angles, a Germanic tribe of Denmark, to assist them in return for land in the richest part of Britain, the southeast. This was very successful, and all seemed well, but the Angles soon expanded out of their enclave. Everywhere else in Europe, when the Germanic invaders came, they saw, they conquered, and then they assimilated. Contrary to our popular belief in the moat, which separates us from the continent as a natural defence, it in fact made entry much simpler for those who attempted it, much like today. When Germanic tribes moved across the continent, it was generally in all-male war bands. It was simply too dangerous to move over hostile territory with the entire tribe, with womenfolk nursing their infants and the sick and old slowing everything down. Upon their conquest of new territory, it was normal for the men to intermarry with local women, convert to Christianity, and learn the language. Thus, they assimilated into local culture. When travelling across the sea to Britain, however, it was much more simple to bring everybody along. The Angles could ship whole clans across to the Saxon shore in a day or two, landing at well-built, long-familiar Roman ports. As such, there was no need to immediately assimilate with the native Britons, so the Angles retained much of their culture, and in fact spread it far and wide, and they retained their pagan beliefs for a long time. Intermarriage with natives was much less prevalent than on the continent, which explains why less of the present-day English genetic makeup is Anglo-Saxon than is generally assumed. As Anglo-Saxon influence grew, Romano-British culture was eventually wiped out. Just as today, where the modern English language has essentially replaced the native languages of Britain, despite not replacing the populations there, so too did Old English replace the variant of Common Brittonic language spoken in what would later become modern-day England. Common Brittonic lives on in another form, however. It survived in the parts of Britain which the invaders did not reach, and became Welsh and Cornish. As the Anglo-Saxons inhabited mainly the southeast of England and moved inland from there, the areas which they influenced the most are, naturally, the areas further east. This map of river names in Britain shows how, the further west you look, the more Celtic origin river names remain. So, while the contemporary East English population derives 38% of its ancestry from Anglo-Saxon migrations, this number will almost certainly be lower when moving further towards Wales and Cornwall. It is not known how much was changed by the later Viking invasions, around 800 AD until 1066, but, as the Vikings came from the region of Denmark, they were ethnically indistinguishable from the Anglo-Saxon settlers in any case, comprised of the same people from the same region, only a few hundred years removed. 1066 to the present day. The Norman conquest of Britain did not make much of a difference to the DNA of the English of today. Very few Normans came here anyway, only about 8,000 or so. Despite the huge change they made to culture in England, the society was highly stratified, and, as the elite class, the Normans did not marry beneath themselves. It is thought that DNA from the Normans makes up somewhere around 1% of English genes. While the concepts of England and English as categories came about sometime in the early 10th century, to say that this was the starting point of the English in Britain is false. Our history in these isles goes back much, much further. Moreover, while the native Celtic British culture was replaced by Romano-British culture, and this was in turn replaced by Anglo-Saxon culture throughout the 5th century AD, to say that the people today referred to as the English have only been in what we today refer to as England for 1600 years or so is false, as modern science proves with regards to ethnicity. Though our culture has been replaced, and then shaped in the centuries since, our ethnic lineage is not a matter of debate. Conclusion. In summation, the English can be defined as a Celto-Germanic people indigenous to Britain, who can trace the majority of their ethnic heritage to the Proto-Celtic Brittonic tribes of the Bronze Age, and almost the entirety of their cultural heritage to the later Anglo-Saxon settlers. The terms indigenous and aboriginal should not be confused. Aboriginal comes from the Latin aborigines, meaning the first inhabitants, i.e. having been there for all of time. Indigenous, however, is a less specific term, meaning sprung from the ground, native, or inherent to a place. I think it's fair to say that the English are inherent to England, and ethnic Britons are inherent to Britain. If a people who have inhabited a specific area with only minor variation for over 4 millennia cannot be considered indigenous, then the bar for indigeneity has been set so high that the word ceases to lose any meaning. The English are distinct from the Welsh and the Scots in that we have a unique cultural and genetic inheritance from the Anglo-Saxons. Nevertheless, with regards to our majority genetic lineage and the inheritance of the land of our forebears, we remain the descendants of the Celtic Britons. Now, culture and language are important aspects in defining an ethnic group, to be sure, but when determining indigeneity, culture and language are only secondary factors when compared to the role of a multi-millennial lineage of connection to a physical land, millennia in which our ancestors worked, inhabited, and fought and died for this beautiful country. While our culture has been replaced, we have not. While our language has been replaced, we have not. As long as native British blood flows in our veins, the English remain.